We are here today, Friday, July 13th, 2018, with Sue Ewing. We're here at the Highlands Ranch Mansion, about to conduct an oral history with Sue, with her memories and those of her parents, with the Arapahoe Hunt Club, when they rode here at what at the time was the Phipps Ranch. So, Sue, welcome. And on behalf of the Highlands Ranch Historical Society, we appreciate your willingness to come and share your memories from the past of this place specifically. So tell me a little bit about you. Spell your name, tell me where you live now.
Hey, I'm Sue Ewing. It's S-U-E, Ewing, E-W-I-N-G. I live in Centennial. I was raised part of my life in California and the rest of my life down south of Castle Rock, 3 miles out on a 55-acre farm. And we had our horses that we rode with the Arapahoe Hunt during the winter. My folks were the photographers for the hunt, and that is how we were members of the hunt.
What were your parents' names?
My mother was Malitha King and my father was Richard King. My mother's background was the fact that she was raised in Denver in the Wash Park area. She lived off of Alameda and Williams Street and rode in the Polo Club area riding horses for Earl Morris, who was a member of the hunt. And I think that's how she got invited to be a member of the hunt and how they started. And as to when they started their photography business that they did and became photographers, I don't know that much. That would have been part of the childhood that I was either too young or I was in California for.
When do you think they started riding with the hunt?
I'm going to say that they probably started riding in 48. They were in California. They were married in California in 46. I was born in Denver in 47. So I'm going to say that most of 47, Mom was not doing a lot of major riding. So I would say they started in 46 or 48 as members of the riding with the hunt again.
Okay. What are your earliest memories, and when did you ride with the hunt?
Okay, my earliest memories would have been probably about 1958. My folks bought the farm down south of Castle Rock in 57, and I came back to live with them that summer. And at that point I didn't ride, so it would have been 57 to 58 that I'd started learning to ride. And either in 58 or 59, I would have started riding on what was known as the junior hunt. Junior hunt was run on Saturdays. We would start about 10 o'clock in the morning, and we only rode for 2 hours, so it would end by noon. So it was not, the hounds were not out long, and the horses were not out long, so that they'd be ready for the Sunday hunt.
I'm assuming also you were still hunting coyote?
We always hunt coyote, that was...
And did you always find prey to chase?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm sure we did, because it was just something that we did go out. I know that George, who was the master of the hounds, would call the hounds back. So there was nothing ever killed on a Saturday hunt.
What was the organization of the junior hunts? Who was leading the group and the leadership?
To my recollection, I thought that Mr. Phipps was always our leader in the hunt. Every hunt that I've been on, I don't remember anybody else leading it.
Even the junior hunts?
Even the junior hunts. He was always active with us, interacted with us, and was always treated us very openly.
And what you mentioned George before, was this George Beeman?
It was George Beeman, and as far as I remember, he also had his daughter Bunny, who was one of the whips, and his son Marvin, who was a whip, and Kay Morgan, who was Bunny's husband. Those were the 3 whips that we had with the hunt.
When you speak of whips, tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, whips were the outriders with the hunt, and they would ride out with George and the hounds, and they would keep the eye out there. They would go out riding off out of the field to look for coyote, to maybe spot where they might need to take the hounds rather than having them just follow George. They might say they would spot a coyote or something. They would either signal with their horns or maybe hands or something, but they would signal and George would turn the hounds towards that direction.
I understand the whipper-ins had caps that would distinguish them in the field so that people could pick them up.
They wore caps, and Mr. Phipps also wore a cap. He never wore a hat. I always remember him riding with on the weekends it would be on Saturdays or any of the days that were not normal hunts or not formal hunts, he would be wearing a informal jacket, which would have been a tweed type jacket coat, and he would also be wearing a cap. They were the ones that wore the caps.
On average, how many people participated in a junior hunt when you were doing this?
I'd say we had anywhere from 20 to 40 people. It would be the parents and their kids. So, if you had 20 kids out, you had at least 20 parents and maybe, two set, mom and dad. In my case, it was usually mom. It was not both parents. So it was just mom and I.
So tell me, on a hunt, realizing the limit was 2 hours, what did you do before the hunt? What did you do after the hunt?
Well, before the hunt, since we didn't keep our horses at the stables. Of course, it was all the preparation time of getting the horses ready, saddled, loaded into the truck, brought up, unloaded, and then we waited around up at the stables with everybody else as they got their horses out of the stables. And then once George brought the hounds out of the kennels, we would head out, and where we rode out of would have been what is now the law enforcement shooting range. But that's where our kennels were, was down there at the law enforcement shooting range, and we would ride out there, and it was always at a walk. You never rode out of the stable area at a run, at a trot, or anything else. It was always at a walk, and we would go out, I'm going to say about a half a mile before we'd even start doing anything. And then after the hunt, it was just loading the horses and going home and having lunch at home. There was no clubhousing or other things that they would normally do on a Sunday hunt.
Mm-hmm. When you went out, how many hounds went out with you?
That I can't tell you. I honestly,
A bunch, huh?
There was a bunch, and it may have been that may have been one of the situations where they used it as a training hunt for them. So I don't know, because I don't even remember how many hounds were at the kennels.
Yep.
Other than there were a lot of dogs.
So you rode from being a pre-teenager until late teens with
Correct.
the hunt.
Correct. My last hunt was I was 18, and that last hunt that I did was in 1966.
Okay. Tell me about what horses you might have owned or ridden on during various hunts during that period of time.
Okay, there were 2 horses that I rode. We had 3 horses most of the time, and at one point we had 4. My dad had a big gray, he called him Why Worry. My mother rode a mare named Pip Trick, and she was part of, our mare was Miss Pippin, and Mr. Phipps had a stud that she used for her father. So that was that. And then I rode a horse named Rusty. He was a strawberry roan, 16 hands, which as a little kid is high. 3/4 thoroughbred, 1/4 draft, and he threw the draft. But he was a very dependable horse, and that was why I was put on him when I learned to ride. And that's who I hunted until, I think it was about my last year of hunting. And then I rode the horse that my mom had bought at that time for my dad. And I switched to him. His name was Andy. He was a colored dun. He was a dun-colored horse, and I don't know what he was as to breed. He might have been some quarter horse and some thoroughbred. He was a horse that we had bought from one of the local ranchers.
Mm-hmm. Any memorable hunts come to your mind when you were riding?
Well, in the background, nothing stood out as a hunt because they were all somewhat memorable in the fact that we got to go ride from Highlands Ranch. From basically Santa Fe, we rode almost clear over to I-25, which at that time was Highway 85 or 87. We rode on, from Highlands Ranch, we would ride on Daniels Park, we would ride on Cherokee Ranch, sometimes if we went south, and we also rode on MacArthur Ranch. That's how we would end up between Daniels Park and MacArthur Ranch would take us clear over to 25. So we covered a lot of ground when we did do a hunt. And we could, sometimes we might come as clear north as the mansion up here. Most of the time we stayed more south because that's where the hillier ground was and the terrain. And with Daniels Park, when we'd go in there, we were always warned to watch out for the buffalo.
Or the rattlesnakes.
Rattlesnakes weren't out at that time of year.
Yeah.
It was more the buffalo.
You hunted the cold months of the year, did you not?
Yes, we did. It was, hunts would end about April, and then we'd start September, October, somewhere in there when it started. I think we started after the first frost or freeze that we would start getting in the fall, because the ground would be cleaner for the hounds to smell the coyote scents when we hunted in the winter. In the summertime, there was too many other types of scents that they would have to work around.
Ever have weather be a factor of whether you didn't hunt during the winter?
Oh yes, if it was below zero, we definitely were not out. Not only was that for the hounds' benefit, but they thought of the comfort of us. So I know that we would hunt under freezing because I can remember my dad having hand warmers, things like that. You wore a couple of pairs of gloves if you needed to and things to stay warm, and your long underwear. But if it got too cold or if it was snowing, we may not go out. And we'd get a call. They had their phone trees as to whether we were going that day or not.
Good. What other memories of hunting would you like to share with us from your own personal experience?
Well, I always found it enjoyable and found that one of the things that I liked and enjoyed was what we would call a hunt breakfast. And those hunt breakfasts were, I know of at least once a year, but it seems to me they were a couple of times a year. And a hunt breakfast was done after the hunt, especially at the end of the season. And that one was done usually here at the mansion. And it was the one time that we did all get to come to the mansion inside. And it was usually a catered affair in the fact that it was a buffet, but it was catered unless Mr. Phipps had his staff making it. But the way that I knew it was as catered. And those were always nice social times that the kids from the hunts, everybody came because most of us finished the hunting season and mothers and fathers brought their kids even from the Saturday hunts.
Sue, you were involved in the hunt because of your parents involved in the hunt. Tell me a little bit more about how they got involved and what official or semi-official responsibilities they had relative to taking pictures during the hunts and how that occurred.
Okay. Well, my father was from California and my mother was from Denver, so of course that's one of the strange mix-ups. But my mother had taken a trip with my grandmother out to California, and she was riding in stables out in the Berkeley, Oakland Bay Area. And she was going to do a ride, and at that time the owner of the stable said, well, you can't go out by yourself, even though Mom had been riding for almost 20 years at that point. So he had my dad go out with her, and that's how they met. And she wasn't real impressed with him as a rider, but anyway, somewhere something clicked, and they were married in 1946 in Oakland in the Alameda County Courthouse. Then they moved back here. I think Mom didn't like being away from Colorado, and she resumed I'm assuming, I'm having to make some speculations because I don't know. My mom was very private on a lot, but anyway, they resumed the riding and stuff because she's always wanted to ride. She always rode, and she may have been at that time riding other horses. I think the photography side came from my dad because he enjoyed doing that type of thing and such. So I think that's where that side came into. They did start a photography business because they would do pictures at horse shows, gymkhanas and other things, as well as with the hunt as an extra source of income as a young couple.
I understand you brought some pictures that you've donated to the Highlands Ranch Mansion that your parents took in various hunts. Tell me a little bit about the process. Were they taken from the group of hilltoppers that were following the hunt, or were they actually participating on horseback and shooting pictures from high up on a horse?
I won't say all of them. Majority of the pictures were taken from on a horse. The reason I say not all of them, Mom may have hilltopped after she'd had a fall, which I had forgotten about, but she may have hilltopped then and taken some, but the majority of the pictures were taken from horseback. Dad usually had a camera stuck back down in his coat and would pull it out. They would take pictures before the hunt, around the stable area. They sometimes took pictures of people on their horses because they wanted a portrait of them on their horse or that type of thing. So there was always something going on with them. And they used to use Kodak reflex cameras, which were very compact, probably about, I'm going to say about a 4x6 camera, and not more than about 2 or so inches thick. So they were very thin cameras. They didn't have a lot of lenses with them and that type of thing, and that's what they used.
Okay, wonderful. And were they the only photographers typically on a hunt?
As far as I know,
Designated as...
they were designated as the hunt photographers.
That's for everyone.
Right. Right. They were the hunt photographers. That was how our membership was with the hunt. That was our official capacity. And therefore, as far as I understand, I think in talking to Mom about it or later as I was older, that's why we did not end up paying dues, was because we were the official photographers.
Most of the pictures you brought are black and white? Or...
They didn't start color pictures until mid-60s. Most of the stuff was black and white before then. Color was not a stable process in the photography business for them. And until they could find a film or a chemical process that would develop and keep the color photos stable and not fading, they stayed away from that. So yes, most of the pictures I have here are black and white because that was what they would shoot.
Back in those days, were there commercial photo processing labs, or did they do their own developing?
My folks did not use a lab. They did their own developing. Mom would take the rolls of film home, and we would use, I could see her sitting on the couch. She would have a black bag on her lap, and she would put the rolls of film in there, the reels that the film would go onto, and then zip it up, put her hands in the bag, so if you're living in a dark thing, and unroll the film onto there, open the canisters up and unroll it and put it onto the reels, and then she would put the reels in the developing tank, and that way nothing had daylight to it. And then she would develop that with the chemicals, and the bathtub was the basin, so we always had a hose hooked up to the shower so that she could, when it came time for doing the water part, would wash it from there. But yes, she developed all the film, and I think they did 5 or 6 rolls at a time. Then they'd be hanging off the shower rack to dry from little hooks with clothespins on them to dry, and she'd have a clothespin at the top and a clothespin at the bottom to keep them straight. And off their bedroom, they had a dark room that Dad had built for her. The window was painted black. I had a vent in there because the chemicals they used then were actually had quite a bit of smell to them when they developed, but they had the printer that they would develop on. She'd put print the pictures on to the paper. Then she'd have trays which would have the hypo, a fix, and the rinse and this before it would go into what they called a water bath. And the water bath was in the bathtub, running water all the time. So the fix, and then she did have a dryer, and that was for the prints, and that was where the prints were set on this metal screen, and if they were glossy, they were set face down on the flat metal, and that was out in the dining room. And if they were to be matte prints, then the prints were turned backwards, and the matte was from the canvas that would hold them in.
How are these photos shared, if at all, with other members of the Hunt Club?
I honestly cannot tell you the answer to that one. I don't know how she shared them. She may have taken them and after a hunt, taken them out to the clubhouse. But otherwise, I don't know.
I guess she couldn't exactly take them to Walgreens for prints.
No, she didn't do anything.
things.
Walgreens wasn't even around as a photo place and so on.
Sue, we're back, and it's time now for you to tell us perhaps something about some of the pictures that your parents took that seem to be most memorable to you.
Okay. I'm going to start with one. This is a picture of George and hounds. This was down at what we call hunter trials. Hunter trials at that time we do down at Plum Creek Ranch, which is off of 105 out of Sedalia. That would usually be done early September, and what it was it was just people would bring their hunters down to do what they call steeplechase, which would be jumping over jumps, but there would be a distance between, so they weren't close. It's very similar to some of the things that they do in England. But anyway, this is George showing the hounds down at the hunter trials. And here is another one where they're trotting out and pacing them a little faster. So that's what they have for the hunter trials. The next pictures I like are these that we have from up in the kennel area where the hounds are being let out of the kennel and know that they're getting ready for their day at the hunt. And I don't remember, but I would say that we probably had a pack of about 40 to 50 hounds that would go out with us. And this one is a darling one with them out there. And here we are, he's getting ready to lead them out. And this is where we've ridden out and the hounds are ready and we're all waiting behind George. In here you would see George is here in the center. This was his daughter Bunny, and not knowing for sure, but this was either Kay Morgan or Marvin Beeman. And then here is the riders of the hunt, and we are all sitting here waiting. And again, this would have been about a half a mile out from where the kennel area was. This is a picture that my dad took of Mr. Phipps, where he was down lower in an area and Dad was a little higher on a hill. This picture is one that we've started out and where you can see that the horses are getting ready to trot or something, because when we went out we would start off in a walk and then we would trot as we'd get out there. We didn't do any full runs until the hounds were chasing a coyote.
And most of the hunts started at what's now the Law Enforcement Training Center. And depending upon what was decided, you might go in a number of different directions.
Correct. That is correct.
South or east.
Depending on whatever George had figured out in the morning, and I have a feeling that what they probably did was either on Saturdays when they did the junior hunt, or they had gone out, say, in an afternoon the day before to get an idea where they could spot the coyotes. They didn't always kill the coyotes. We would chase them, but we didn't always kill. When we did have a kill, there was a rule of the first man up to where the coyote was that had been killed got the head. The first woman got the tail. And the first kids got the feet. So those were all done. They were sent then to the taxidermist that was in Lavieres, or actually in Gann, and they were mounted. And I do remember having a coyote head in our living room.
Were these, when a coyote was finally trapped or cornered, would they be shot, or what would typically happen?
No, they were never shot. The hounds were the ones that took them down. They weren't mauled, but whatever. I was never up there at the front to know exactly what happened. So, I don't remember hearing a gun, so I don't think they carried a gun.
Perhaps too much detail.
More detail than I needed as a kid. So. Okay, then the next pictures, these are sort of after a hunt. And in this picture, you'll see that George is on the ground and he is praising the hounds. And one of the things that we always did after the hunt is we would ride by George and thank him for a nice hunt. That was part of the hunt protocol. This one I think is darling because it's showing the hounds cooling off, and where this is on the ranch I'm not sure, but it was apparently I'm thinking a spring day when it was kind of warm for them and they're cooling off before after their runs. And this one, it's more in the wintertime, but again, you can see George is petting the hounds and people are sitting around waiting, and we do thank George as we go.
When you became 16, you became a regular member?
Yes, I did.
And did that change the length of the hunts that you participated in?
No, it didn't, because most of the hunts, I would say from the time I was 12 on, I participated in the Sunday hunts. So those were the full hunts. And those could go for from 2, 3 to 4 hours or longer, depending on what our prey was and how we'd done. And then there were days we could be out and we really didn't find anything. The hounds would go on a scent and it wouldn't come up to image of anything and it would die out. So
what was the range of the length of the hunt in terms of how far you rode?
We rode literally from what is Highway 85 over to what now is Highway 25.
And that's about 8 miles or so, maybe 8 or 10 miles.
Yes, it is. It was a long distance. Most of the time we stayed on the ranch though.
And back.
Yeah. Yeah, because you'd go out and then, you went back. And
come back. Yeah.
If you went out 4 or 5 miles, you had 4 or 5 miles to go back. And the rule was when you were heading back, you could trot your horses. You were not to gallop. You could trot your horses up to about where we would start. And from there in, you had to walk your horses back to the stables. So no horse got in the idea of that it could run back to the stables. And a lot of the horses were boarded. So a lot of people came out from Denver. There was like the Morrises, there were the Grants, which had the property, it's now Grant's Ranch. There was the doctor, I forgot his name, but where West, the garden shop that's on County Line, he had that property and so on. So we had a lot of people that had property in a lot, but they would keep their horses at the stables because they didn't want to be bothered. And when they were at the stables, the horses were already groomed, saddled, and ready to go. So all they had to do was mount their horse. When they got back, all they had to do was get off and give it to the groom.
Yeah.
After a hunt, we would go to the clubhouse, which was, for many years, just a caboose. And what the clubhouse was where we would have our sandwiches or lunch, that type of thing. Members were able to bring their own booze in. It was during an era when drinking was done afterwards. And they would have their own drinks, their booze, and their mixers. And everybody kept their bottle at the clubhouse. So, and it was marked, and everybody knew that was so-and-so's and so-and-so. So they had their own mixers and stuff. When we would go as kids, a lot of us went up in the cupola of the caboose, so we'd climb the stairs and sit up in the top and let the adults have the downstairs. So it was a lot of fun to do things like that. I'm not exactly sure when they expanded it. Sometime in the 60s.
What did they add?
they added a big gathering room into it. So we still had the caboose, but they had added on a big area for people to gather and talk. We had chairs and stuff, so they had room to talk rather than just stand. Because a caboose is really just, you know, an aisle and some benches on the sides before, and this way they had a regular meeting room. It might have been about the size of the room we're in now.
Okay, continue.
Okay. When I was looking at this picture, I just realized everybody's got on tweed coats. So I'm thinking this was a Wednesday hunt, the informal hunt. And as you can see with the background, I'm thinking this is closer to Daniels Park and that, looking at the terrain of the territory. I do remember when I was growing up one time that Mom had gone out on a Wednesday hunt, and I was at the babysitter's, because I must have been about 6th grade, 5th or 6th. I'm going to say 6th grade. And she was being driven home by some people from Colorado Springs. And the reason she was driven home was because her horse had tripped and fallen, and Mom had had a concussion and stuff from that hunt. And that's why I think that might have been the only time she hilltopped, was during about that 6-week period as she recovered. But it was, you know, they told me, you know, she's okay, but this is what happened. I'm assuming somewhere down the line that Dad went up and got the horse and brought the horse back, because I know, but it wasn't done the first day. It was probably done on the weekend. But usually there weren't any injuries. Occasionally there was. I do remember one time that Mom had invited some kids up from the academy where she had taught riding to officers' kids, and this was not a good hunt. They came in on a Sunday hunt, and one of the girls' horses was not in a good condition and did not complete the hunt. And that's the only time I've known of a horse not to complete. Now, one thing that Mr. Phipps did when we had hunts was, if a horse was killed, had died, or even they had a pasture, if you had an old horse you could bring them up here, they would leave them out in the fields as coyote bait. So they had places for them that they knew they could scrounge and feed, and that kept the coyotes around. It also kept them away from the cattle. So that type of thing.
Did you ever have mishaps of your own on all the years that you hunted or rode? Anything memorable?
I didn't have mishaps on the hunt, but I do have a memorable in the fact that my mom was working with a gal that she had trained, and they took Rusty out one afternoon to ride, and when he came back, and then I was going to get to ride him afterwards, he really didn't want to be out in the pasture with me, and he turned around and dumped me, and I sprained my ankle. That actually, it turned out later, I found out I broke my ankle. Mom thought it was a sprain, but that's the only mishap that I really had that was serious enough to keep me grounded for a little while. Okay, this picture is of our hilltoppers. The hilltoppers were either wives, most of them were wives of some of the huntsmen. They were people that wanted to see the hunt but could not, did not have horses to ride. They always were out with us. So if somebody did get hurt, they were there they were our EMTs, okay, that we would have. And they would always be back on a hill. You always knew they were there. They followed us out behind. But you know, it was very quiet. They were off to the side, so you never really knew you knew they were there, but you didn't know they were there. They were never in the center of any place we went, unless the coyote went by them. Then yes, we'd go by them too. This picture is just this is afterwards. This has got hounds in it. It's very dark, so you can't really see them there. Here's another one, and as you can see, we did talk about riding in the winter, spring or whatever. There is snow on the ground. I'm thinking this is probably one of the winter hunts because of the fact that there's snow on the ground like in January and stuff before we got our heavy snows. And usually if a hunt was canceled, it seems to me it was in the spring, other than the cold weather, which you get at that time we get that in January, not February. Stock show season.
Stock show days. Mm-hmm. That was the tradition.
Yep.
Stock show days were the coldest month of the year.
Right. And so the snow would not melt at that time.
Any difficulty with ice on the trails in those winter hunts?
Yeah, and what we would do with the horses, we would have them shod, and in between the shoe and their hoof, there was a rubber pad that we would put that had a ball on it. And the ball would go down so the ice would not pack up in their feet. And that would keep them from getting feet frozen from the snow and things like that. And it just helped a little bit. And we'd be warned if somebody was in an area where there was ice, riders warned everybody about their problems. So if there was ice, you'd go wear ice and that type of thing. So people knew, or they could try and find a different trail down when we were going down the hills and stuff.
During the hunt, realizing it might last for hours and there'd be differing speeds depending on whether you were waiting to find something to chase or actually chasing on a gallop. What was the ratio of that time? How much time were you really at full out gallop?
Not a lot. Gallops were, say full out gallops were usually when we were chasing, and they weren't long periods of time. I wouldn't say more than about 5 to 10 minutes, honestly, because you didn't want to tire the horses. If you did it too long, your horses were tired, they could get winded. There were, horses were considered our transportation, so they were very important, and you did not wind the horses that way. It was done horses in mind, dogs in mind, or the hounds. It was all kept in mind of safety, and even though we didn't have safety guidelines, there was safety to riders. This is just another one of Mr. Phipps down there. This one I picked out just to show that here is a mother and her son. The son is in a tweed coat with a riding cap. The mother is in her black coat and she has a riding derby. At that time, children either wore derbies or caps, and the adults wore either derbies or top hats, and I'll go into those a little later. Most of the women wore wore derbies. In fact, all women wore derbies, and we had to wear our hair very neatly. We had to use hair nets. If you had long hair, your hair was in a hair net. And during that era, most women had long hair. It wasn't a lot of people.
Was that a safety concern somehow, or?
It was a grooming concern. Okay, with the way that you dressed, you had shirts that you wore white shirts. We used ties, so we called them stock ties, and those were under our coats. Those were required. It was the way it was done. And a stock tie ran around, and you tied it, and then you had a pin to hold it in place, and everybody wore that. Girls, boys, women, men. It was not optional. That was part of the dress was formal on a Sunday hunt. The Saturday hunt and the Wednesday hunts were informal. Anyway, the formal, we had the red coats that the men wore, and the black collar was the significance for the Arapahoe Hunt. This is the same type of attire worn over in England. It's also the same type of attire worn on the East Coast, where they had the fox hunts. And Arapahoe Hunt was a member of the fox hunt. Other than we don't have a lot of foxes out here, so coyotes were ours.
I'm told that those coats have a history, and you've heard them referred to as pinks before?
Yes.
You know the story?
No, I don't.
I understand in England they were invented by a gentleman named Pink.
Oh, okay.
That's part of the reason why they've continued to be called that over the years.
Okay. And I think that the ones with the red coats, or the pinks in our group, I believe they were probably the members that either paid the higher dues or had a position in there, and so on. Otherwise, if you were a member of the hunt, you had a black coat, and your black coat with silver buttons, and that. If you were not a member of the hunt, you always wore a tweed coat. And that's because you had not been invited to become a member of the hunt. Once you became a member, which I did at 16, after a hunt, the members were awarded their buttons at the hunt dinner that they would have, and that I did not go to. That my folks went to that. And then once you got your buttons, then you would get a black coat. You could have a black coat made that would fit you, which I had done.
How large was the membership of the hunt club on average?
I honestly don't know, but I'd say there were close to 50 to 60 people out there every week. So it was very active. It was quite large. To me that was large, but when you're riding there, you don't always pay attention to that type of stuff. That wasn't important as a kid. And so on, but anyway.
Anything you'd care to comment on the caps, what they might mean, and the significance?
Well, the caps, I do know that Mr. Phipps wore a cap and the houndsman wore a cap, which was George, Bunny, Kay, and Marvin. They all wore caps. The rest, either the men wore top hats, or they wore derbies. And maybe kids wore the caps. But most men and women wore a hunt derby. And this picture shows people at the end, and you can see their derbies that they have on. They were hard, and I guess you could say they were like what Laurel and Hardy wore. That was the style of the derby, as the best comparison. Here you can see, and again, I think this is Daniels Park area. This is one of the few color photography, but you can see the red coats here, the rest of us in black. And usually when we were chasing a coyote, you'd find that the hunt group divided into about thirds. You'd have the faster riders that would ride up front with Mr. Phipps and that. Then the rest of it, then you'd have those in the middle that were, okay, we're comfortable, but we don't, we're not worried about catching something. And then you'd have the slower riders, which were either older horses or older riders and that type of thing. So it just sort of grouped out on its own. This picture is just of a whip out there by himself, probably looking for the coyote or something, or looking to see signs.
Are there any dogs in that picture, or any hounds?
No, that's why I'm saying it's just the whip. This picture I have here is just to show you that in the wintertime we would do what's known as a hunter cut. This is not one of our horses, but somebody else. You will notice that the legs still have hair on them, and the horse is shaved the rest of the way. And the reason for the hunter cut was because when you're especially doing it more in the spring, was because as things melted, you'd have the mud from the horses would be slinging up. Well, you didn't want to clean that mud out of their coats, so they would do a hunter cut so they would stay out of the main part of the thing. You can clean their legs easier than you can do the horse's belly and that. And yeah, otherwise it was a major job, and I have had to do that. This is just a good one of George and the hounds. Down below, Dad's up on a hill, and again, this might have been before we started, but I think this was over at the law enforcement area. Hounds out on the sun out here, and I'm going to say this is, I have to look at that. I would say that is before they've gotten loose, or they had just done ascending and stuff, and they were there. And again, you can see the snow, so definitely winter. And I'm thinking that this type of thing would probably be about a January meeting.
Is there a windmill in the background in that picture?
No, telephone poles.
Telephone pole.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That's when we still had telephone poles up in
Do you remember the top of the hill up here when there were two windmills?
I think we have somewhere, either I've got them at home or something, but we have seen some pictures with them.
Remember that? I've seen pictures of two up here.
Yeah, I don't remember if there were two or one. My other part of living at the ranch was I went to Douglas County High School, and at that era, Douglas County High School was a four-year school. And I went to junior high, Douglas County Junior High, in Castle Rock, and that they made into a junior, it was the original high school, and they made that into the junior high in 62 when they opened up the Douglas County High School on the frontage road out of town. At that time, everybody in the county that went to school, to the grade schools, which had originally gone to 8th grade, went down to Castle Rock. And so I met kids then that had come up here, gone to Plum Creek, that lived here on the ranch. Their parents were hands here and so on. So that's how I became a little more familiar with this end of the ranch. I always knew about the south end of the ranch, but I didn't know, you knew it was here. As I told Debbie a few days ago, the main entrance used to be off of Broadway when you came into the ranch. University didn't go through, Colorado didn't go through, all those ended at County Line Road.
It remained that way for many years, actually.
Okay. This is another one of George, and again, in this one, you can see him thanking the hounds. He's doing that. And this is one of the whips off to the side. I'm not sure who, again, it's a small picture, so I don't know. But I think I always like the fact that he praised the hounds. And as I think I said earlier, we always thanked him. That was hunt etiquette. You always thanked him. We would usually thank Mr. Phipps up at the clubhouse. But we always thanked George out in the field, because even though Mr. Phipps was the hunt master, it was actually the master of the hounds that ran the hunt. It was because of him. This picture, again, this one is definitely off of the horse, but you can see George is there and the hounds are out here. This picture I just threw in mainly because it's a good picture and it's Daniels Park area, I'm pretty sure. And off in the background, you can see Devil's Head. So on a nice day, we could have a nice clear view. Of course, it wasn't as developed as it is now, and you had that. Here's a picture of the hunt as we're taking off following George. Everybody started, right. So you're just starting the run after this, and you would see Mr. Phipps here, and then the gentleman's usually with the tall hats. And the last one's just one that my dad took. This is my mom as she's riding down. So again, very obviously off of horseback.
Yep. Did you bring any pictures of you?
Yes, I did, but they're not related with the hunt.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Good. What other memories would you like to share about hunting at the ranch as part of the Arapahoe Hunt Club? Anything else you'd like to share?
Well, things that I remember in the summertime, they used to do polo down there at the law enforcement area. That first field that you come into is the polo field.
Marvin Beeman helped his dad build that polo field.
Did he?
It was the first grass field they'd had. They evidently had a dirt one just west of the mansion where we are now.
Okay.
But that was the first grass field, and among other reasons, Lawrence Phipps, Mr. Phipps, sent Marvin to Caro A&M with 3 polo ponies.
Oh, wow.
Because at that point, polo was still a club sport at
Right.
Caro A&M. So he boarded 3 polo ponies that Mr. Phipps gave him, partly in thanking him for building the polo field down here.
Yeah, well, I can remember as a kid they'd had the polo matches, and we went up a few times, and again they were taking pictures and stuff. And as kids, who wants to sit in the bleachers? So we would go down to where the goalposts were and be there to get the polo ball when it came out, to get it back to them so they could play it. So when they would play, polo is played in checkers and such. So that's the kind of memories I have there, and I do know that they had sprinklers down there for that system.
Yeah, I guess they have some newer polo fields on the other side of Santa Fe now.
They do, right off of Mineral and Santa Fe, right there On the other side of the creek, of the river, there's a polo fields there, and they do have some special things that go there. It's in a gated community, but I haven't been there.
Anything else come to mind?
No, I think that's it.
All right then, so I wanted to thank you on behalf of the Historical Society. It's been fun listening to your memories of somebody who actually participated in rides for a number of years, and it's especially nice that you decided to share some pictures with the mansion here of photos that your parents took from actually on rides.
Well, I'm one of these persons who, I guess you could call me a hoarder in some ways. I don't like to throw things out, and if I can find something like this, I don't want to put it in the trash. It means something it will be good for somebody, so that's why. I figured, well, if I had approached the Arapahoe Hunt about it, and I didn't get a response, so in Debbie talking about being a docent down here, that's when I mentioned I had some pictures, and that's what brought me over here.
Good. Well, thank you for sharing the pictures with the mansion, and thank you for sharing your story with us today.
You're welcome.